Winter had arrived far earlier than anyone expected that year. Long before the calendar officially announced the season, icy winds had already settled over the abandoned landfill on the edge of town. Every morning, the place looked quieter than it had the day before. The piles of discarded furniture, twisted metal, broken concrete, and torn plastic bags were covered with a thin layer of frost that sparkled under the pale sunrise. The silence felt heavier than usual because it was the kind of silence that often followed a long, freezing night, a night that not every stray animal managed to survive. For the dogs that called this forgotten place home, every sunrise was another small miracle. There were no warm houses waiting for them, no fireplaces, no bowls of fresh food, and no owners searching for them. They had only each other. They slept wherever they could find shelter from the wind, beneath old refrigerators, inside rusted barrels, under collapsed roofs, or between piles of scrap wood. Every winter became another test of endurance, and every night they survived was another victory against impossible odds. For months, I had been visiting this landfill whenever work and time allowed. It wasn't part of any organized rescue program. No cameras followed me there, and no one expected me to go. I simply couldn't ignore the dogs after seeing how they struggled to stay alive. Over time, they began recognizing the sound of my truck. Some would come running as soon as they heard the engine, while others, having spent their lives avoiding people, stayed hidden until they were certain it was safe. The first thing I ever built for them wasn't much. Someone had thrown away a large wooden cabinet that still had solid walls and a sturdy roof. With a little work, I turned it into a shelter. I removed the broken shelves, reinforced the frame, and laid thick blankets, worn rugs, old jackets, and pieces of carpet inside. Friends donated a few blankets they no longer needed, and neighbors occasionally left old towels at my door after hearing what I was doing. It wasn't a perfect shelter, but it blocked the wind, stayed surprisingly dry, and gave several puppies a place to sleep without lying directly on the frozen ground. Every visit followed the same routine. I checked the shelter first, counted the dogs, refilled their water whenever it hadn't frozen solid, and brought whatever food I could afford that week. Some days it was kibble. Other days it was leftover meat from a local butcher or simple rice mixed with canned food. The dogs never complained. They accepted every meal with gratitude because they had learned that nothing in life was guaranteed. Then one icy morning, everything felt different. As I stepped out of the truck, I expected the familiar chorus of barking and wagging tails. Instead, an unsettling silence greeted me. A few adult dogs stood near the shelter, but they didn't run toward me. They simply watched. Their ears were lowered, and even the playful puppies remained unusually still. Something was wrong. I walked faster toward the wooden shelter, my boots crunching across the frozen ground. Before I even reached the entrance, I noticed a tiny shape lying beside the doorway. It was one of the puppies. At first, I hoped he was only asleep. Puppies often curled into tight little balls to conserve warmth. But as I knelt beside him, my heart immediately sank. I gently reached down and touched one of his tiny paws. It was frozen solid. He couldn't have been more than a month old. His little body had stiffened during the night, and his fur was covered with tiny crystals of frost. His eyes remained peacefully closed, almost as though he had simply drifted into sleep and never woken up again. There was no struggle left on his face, only silence. I carefully lifted him into my arms and wrapped him inside my jacket for a moment, even though I knew it was already too late. Standing there in the freezing wind, I couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to surviving. If the temperature had been just a little warmer, if I had arrived one evening earlier with more blankets, if someone had found him before he was abandoned, perhaps this story would have ended differently. No matter how many rescues I've been part of over the years, losing even one life never becomes easier. Every animal has a story that deserved a better ending. After gently laying him back down, I forced myself to keep looking around. The remaining puppies slowly emerged from the shelter one by one. Their tiny ribs were clearly visible beneath their thin coats. Frost clung to their whiskers, and their little noses were cold enough to make them sneeze every few seconds. Some were so weak they stumbled while walking. Others simply watched me with tired eyes that seemed far older than they should have been. Their stomachs had been empty for far too long. The adult dogs looked no better. They had spent the entire night protecting the puppies from the wind, curling their own bodies around them to share what little warmth they had left. Their loyalty to one another was remarkable. Even in the harshest conditions, they still looked after the weakest members of their little family. I knew there wasn't enough food in my truck. Without wasting another minute, I hurried home. When I walked through the front door, my mother looked at my face and immediately understood that something terrible had happened. I didn't have to explain much. She had heard many rescue stories over the years, and she knew that the hardest mornings were always the quietest ones. Together, we started preparing as much food as we possibly could. She filled our biggest cooking pot with rice porridge and let it simmer until it became warm and soft enough for the puppies to digest easily. She cracked several fresh eggs into the mixture to give the weakest ones extra protein. Meanwhile, I opened every can of dog food we had left and mixed it with dry kibble for the adult dogs. We searched through the kitchen, collecting every safe ingredient we could spare. We weren't wealthy. We couldn't buy premium food for dozens of stray animals every week. But kindness has never depended on wealth. Sometimes it simply means sharing what you already have. By the time we carried everything outside, steam was still rising from the pots despite the freezing air. The truck filled with the comforting smell of warm food, and for the first time that morning, I felt a small sense of hope. As soon as I turned onto the dirt road leading to the landfill, several dogs heard the familiar sound of the engine. One by one, they appeared from behind broken walls, abandoned machinery, old tires, and mountains of scrap metal. Some wagged their tails cautiously. Others stayed back until they recognized my voice. I placed the first large bowls onto the ground. The adult dogs surrounded them almost immediately, eating with incredible urgency. They barely lifted their heads between bites. Years of surviving on the streets had taught them never to assume another meal would come tomorrow. Watching them eat so desperately reminded me how constant hunger changes behavior. They weren't aggressive because they were cruel. They were desperate because life had forced them to be. The puppies, however, stayed behind. They watched from a distance, too frightened to approach the larger dogs. Their tiny bodies trembled not only from the cold, but also from uncertainty. So I opened another can of food, filled a smaller bowl, and